Massachusetts, where she maintains a studio practice in Somerville and serves as exhibitions manager at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. Her practice combines backcountry leadership skills and cultural anthropology with product design, fiber, and material studies. She received a BFA from the Massachusetts College of Art, where she studied both industrial design and fiber, and an MFA from the fiber department here at Cranbrook in 2005. Abigail has received numerous awards, including a Boston Society of Arts and Crafts Award, a Pollock Krasner Fellowship at the Vermont Studio Center, a Sculpture Space Fellowship, a Kresge, and she's been named a fellow by the Massachusetts Cultural Council. She's exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, and the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Detroit. She has taught at Haystack Mountain School of Craft, as well as the College for Creative Studies. Abigail served as preparator at the museum from 2006 to 2011. This evening, she'll be discussing the progression of her work and the scope of domesticity as it relates to human interaction, the current product market, and our own psychological well-being, touching on themes of independence, survival, and the role of community in making. Welcome, Abigail.
Thank you all. I wanted to thank Jane for inviting me out here. It's a real special honor to work with my most impactful mentor once again. And it's really a sense of coming home for me. Cranbrook has been my home ground for many years, and as you'll see in my slides, home is no small compliment. So I'd like to introduce to you a concise background of my work and thinking. This is roughly how what I'd call a family tree of my concepts work. This chart is a little older now, but it still works. Every single concept are still prominent in what I do. But I might say that it works better read right to left instead of left to right, if you're seeing these concepts as forming a hierarchy. In the following slides, I'll explore how these themes have and continue to play out in my work and practice, and then take some time to delve deeper into some more extensive projects that I've done more recently. Early on, even before I was committed to being an artist, I taught myself how to sew with the goal of making a quilt. I wanted something pliable and practical that I could wrap around myself, and it was important that it was a product of my own hands' labor. I later learned that this primal, really self-protective instinct that drove me to make my first quilt has a really complicated cultural legacy connecting the materials to functionality, to domesticity, and to industry, and the economics of need. Quilts have remained a driving force in my installation work, serving as the protagonists in my installations, representing and exploring issues such as the value and status of handmaking and the portability of comfort, as well as systems of labor and economy. This work at home, it was an installation that was actually my thesis project as a student at Cranbrook. And here I spent time making conceptual work by day and quilting plain functional quilts in my spare time, which sort of satisfied my desire for having a sense of immediate functionality without all the baggage of resolving the weight of the conceptual issues that I was wrestling with. I started looking at how textiles were portrayed in formal museological settings, and for me, I found that a textile taken out of the context of its function, such as when you hang it flat on the wall, becomes flat or lifeless and maybe even purposeless aside from its remaining decorative quality. And to place an object such as a quilt back into the context brings kind of life and respect for its dynamic range of functions. And that's what I was really trying to get at with starting to do this installation work. So I started to build these life-scale installations as windows into the homes where these textiles might have been made. I was also dealing with the formal history of museum display. I wanted these slices of houses to hang fully suspended, like pictures on the wall, in the language of a formal museum practice, but maybe allowing for a little clumsiness. And actually, this work here, it was completely self-supported. It just cantilevered off the wall. The dolly that you see underneath was to assuage Greg Whitcupp's great concern over whether it would hold up over the course of the degree show. So just FYI. Using the same format of home cross-section, my work making home expands on the circular nature of the relationship of hand-making and living with functional objects, creating a continuous loop from hand or machine to its function, in this case, the bed on the right, and in this instance, starting to conflate issues of mass manufacture and disposability with the preciousness of the handmade. This work marks a pivotal moment in my practice when I became acutely conscious of my dialogue with craft in particular, advocating for the preservation and incorporation of handmaking into our daily lives. This thread runs through most of my work that has come after, and you'll see these traces clearly. This is a detail from the right side. The quilt hovers over the bed like those tearaway tissue sheets, you see in doctors' offices. That's what I kept thinking about, and that it was a seemingly endless roll or supply of quilt, and that would in itself imply an ability to dispose of the quilt rather than reuse. And what does that say about value and in relation to handmaking? We're at a moment in history where the field of craft, perhaps encompassing one of the oldest categories of making, is in the process of redefining itself and its position in the arts. Much is being written critically, philosophically, and creatively on the subject. Though my education has a split background in design and fiber, I still consider myself an artist first, but always a craftsman. Of course, these are kind of getting a little well-loved at this point, but people who I admire quite a bit in the field of theory are Glenn Adamson, Richard Sennett, Alyssa Author. They're all just standbys for me in this category. Craftsmanship often serves as the foundation for my work, both as a conceptual driver as well as functionally and materially, even when the method of fabrication runs counter to the function, as in this piece, Moonshining. I insist on a high level of craft in the work I make, even at the great expense of time, and even when the objects don't actually need to perform or function. This level of craftsmanship brings the dialogue I'm playing out with my works into something more approximating the real for me, crossing boundaries with the accessibility that exists in the retail product market, archaeological and museological display, and at the same time contributing to a larger contemporary dialogue that hovers in between art and culture. In my installations, the objects and spaces I create are dictated loosely by some sense of a character. This character, whether I'm really deliberately guiding it or not, sets the tenor for each of my works. I often need to submerge myself into these notions of character to be able to think through a body of work. So this is the character outfitted. And this is what the character did. These are further experiments in defining character. I think Jane will remember these distinctly. This was from a period of time at Haystack where I was a teaching assistant for Jane up there. By using, and actually I'll go back, I'll say that this is not, I don't consider these finished works. This is really, it's like a peek into my digital sketchbook or something. I mean, this is me thinking out loud. Maybe one day I'll get so bold as to do some portraiture, but it doesn't feel relevant right now. It's more of a vehicle to then put back into the architectural spaces that I'm dealing with. By using familiar building techniques and realistic scale, my installations become more broadly understandable, less insular to an art world dialogue. By introducing a character profile into that physical space, into the physical spaces that I create, I'm encouraging the viewer to remain engaged with the protagonist, the unseen protagonist, that is, making the space more believable or perhaps even less noticeable, ultimately immersing the viewer in the impression of the space. And I think this is really where you start to see the background in my work history, where I started doing visual merchandising and window dressing really early on, and then migrated into museum installation and design, and those sort of sense a command of large space and having to give it a focus and a narrative almost, or really inform the way that I work now. This work represented a huge life lesson for me as an artist. This is a recreation of making home, the slide that I showed you a few minutes ago. I had an opportunity in 2013 where a curator at the MCA Chicago was really interested in showing that work. And they wanted that work, that piece. And at that point, I was in the practice of disassembling those installations and repurposing the lumber. Sometimes I would make a bed frame or give the lumber to a friend who had a building project or whatever it was, and the parts would actually go back into my house and furnish my house. I mean, it just didn't seem relevant to hold on to a complete set of this installation. But here I was, 2013, with no work in storage, with this curator and this opportunity in front of me that I really couldn't pass up. So I offered to remake the work, and they graciously offered to pay for the materials and actually build the structure for me. And then it was just up to me to really recreate the interior. So the compromise for me at that point was that I didn't want to remake it exactly to the original. I wanted to update it along the way and use it as an exercise to advance where I was at in my work at that point. That's the side detail, and again, it's with the, 26, 27 odd continuous feet of quilt that runs through it. It was no small feat to fill in those gaps very quickly. During a recent retreat I held with students from the Pacific Northwest College of Art, I had a conversation with some folks about the word survival, realizing it's a word I've thrown around iconically for years, but sensitive to the infinite variations given the context that you use it in. Peter, whom I was speaking with, very readily defined survival as the ability of an individual to survive on their own long enough that they could be rescued by their community. This totally threw me for a loop. Until that point in my life, in my work, survival was something that you were on your own with. And I'll introduce you to Peter when we discuss my project, Living Through Making. But I'm still chewing on this one. In my late teens, in an effort to escape what were then chronic panic attacks and perpetual anxiety, a cluster of symptoms that I live with to this day, I decided that putting myself to some kind of test and getting my mind out of my head and into my body was what I needed to feel strong. This is us. This is actually after we ascended Mount Rainier, which is still one of my most prized accomplishments. The next year, on the eve of my graduation from high school, I enrolled in a 3-month wilderness course with the National Outdoor Leadership School in the American Southwest. I think we were based in Tucson at that point. During this time, I lived out of my backpack, carrying with me everything that I needed to live. We would literally make a new home for ourselves each night, and I became acutely attuned to minute differences in the landscape that would indicate a suitable site to set up camp, whether it was a slight incline, lumpy soil, how far was the access to water. Not only was the removal of city stresses a comfort to me, but my singular focus on my own daily physical needs reoriented my frantic mind at that point in my life. I think this is the moment that I realized that I had the ability to make myself at home anywhere. I realize in retrospect now how profoundly this experience affected me, and that it plays a large role in how I think about basic needs, what constitutes a home, good product design, and the relationship of comfort to survival, even in my thinking, some of my thoughts and thinking about independent economies, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself if I mention economy again. In 2010, I did a residency at Herald Arts, which is situated in the southeastern corner of Ohio as part of a 100-year-old tree farm in Amish country. After spending 2 days unearthing the foundation of an old Quaker meeting house on the property, and this is after 2 days' work. I mean, before you couldn't even tell where there were rocks. I stopped to think why I'd become so attached to the idea of revitalizing this site. I realized then that the potential for a foundation represented both a functional space, but also the basis for a home structure, which for me, it was a profound advancement in thinking from the impromptu campsites of my backcountry days. While I was still out at Herald Arts, I started whittling a series of tool handles for some tool heads that I found at a local flea market. The tools together began to formulate a kit that was starting to speak about excavation and site work. The 2 leather cases were designed to fit onto a bike as panniers, and if you can you can sort of see the shadowy impressions of where the tools go there. And this is just a view of the whole suite, the bike and the tools and the panniers. I've talked about my history living nomadically while in the wilderness, but about 15 years later, after that period, and probably at least as many moves, I bought a house in the Metro Detroit area. This had a profound effect on my practice once again. This is the house I bought, which ultimately became my home. I tore apart the kitchen the day I closed on the house and moved in the day after Christmas during an ice storm with no heat, no hot water, electricity, or any stove to cook on. My life became about improvising while I mapped out a plan for a longer-term renovation. This was New Year's Day, I think. There we go. In the process of learning the practical ways of building, the lines for me became really blurred between my endeavor to understand the concepts and materials of home, as well as the comforts it represented as I had been addressing them in my art practice, with the hard reality of making my home actually livable. Somewhere in the middle, my most massive undertaking was the process of renovating my little one-car garage into a full-fledged studio. And this was somehow the greatest and most confusing marriage of my skills and aspects of my life, to endeavor to comfortably house my art practice and to be in that state of transition. And ultimately, I actually moved out of that house before I even fully completed that renovation. So I have this little pang of regret of never seeing the fruits of my labor, but I did finish it to my satisfaction before I sold the house. I associate portability with freedom, and with that freedom comes the ability to make myself at home anywhere, as I've mentioned with backpacking. This concept definitely goes back to all those experiences in the backcountry and my wilderness work, but are obviously transferable to everyday situations like moving house in an El Camino. These are 2 mobile units containing all that's required for 2 necessary activities, sleep and work. Ironically, cumbersome, these kits represent more of how I feel about compartmentalizing these tasks rather than actually addressing the functionality of these tasks. These 2 installations were from a very early series where I was exploring a simple concept, the concept of moving house. I was working within a slice or a framed context, so the parameters of where the paint was on the wall. These were progenitors to my later larger installations, the ones where it was like cross-section of a house on the wall. In considering the number of times I've moved in the last decade or more than a decade, I chose to make a system of semi-permanent packaging loosely based on shaker design principles as well as my work as an art handler in a museum. This Homemaker series became the first part to a multifaceted series of kits and components that, when built upon, gave the owner the ability to site, build, and inhabit a dwelling of their own. The bicycle provided a flexible and sustainable means of transportation and a platform to design all future building kits to coordinate with, such as the urban prairie wagon. This installation drew together the notions of comfort, survival, portability, and functionality that have long been undercurrents in my work, but often manifested themselves or I explored separately. Expanding on my excavation tools, this suite of timber framing tools would supposedly pack neatly into the bike-drawn prairie wagon, including a temporary shelter to live out of while siting and building a home. Things, and I'll use that sort of capital T, air quotes, things, are universally necessary. And this is where I think of the basic categories of bags, bowls, blankets, and consider that every culture has a version of each of these things. Stuff, again, capital S, air quotes, stuff, is manufactured excess, sometimes useful in a second or third life, sometimes simply bulky trash. Personally, I'm interested in everything that exists in the gray area between thing and stuff. Our belongings that we irrationally become attached to, tools that serve unexpected functions to support us, and materials that help us make do. I accumulate, maybe even borderline hoarding, I'm not sure. I accumulate objects often in groups, such as this grouping here, making relationships to one another based on, could be character, could be functionality, could be a theme that I'm trying to explore in a particular new body of work. Sometimes it's just color, sometimes that just takes the day. I am drawn to objects that are my scale and fit my body, and that's often with an aim to understand their use or fit, and occasionally giving me the ability to assume another character. This was a really informal work that was really a sketch of spatial character development utilizing much of the loot from the previous photo. Going back to my earlier comments about craft bringing my work into a realm of realism, the closer that I can approximate the functional aspects of the objects I reference, the closer the whole narrative gets to some semblance of reality. Or perhaps there's some security that I could pick up and use what I've made, if need be, as though it's some kind of an investment. As I mentioned, I do a lot of collecting. I'm attracted to a broad range of objects, but it's mostly the useful, the used, the mundane, but also curiosities. I love when an object just totally stumps me. These objects, in part, they end up defining our humanity. My interest in functional objects relates back to my early interest in cultural anthropology and the realization that often it's the simple things that we leave behind that tell our stories for us. Each of my collected objects has multiple lives in many different installations that I construct and become like a vocabulary, which again becomes kind of problematic if you go back to that, MCA Chicago piece where I don't have everything boxed up, ready to go. That's this work. Maybe it's in my house. Maybe it's in that part of my studio. Maybe it's on display someplace else. But I like that sort of, that blend of life and art for me. This was another just impromptu experiment to test the functional limits of an object that I consider of extreme comfort, the sheepskin. This was a little unusual for me, unplanned, and it was somewhat of a kinesthetic exercise that I set up to examine a material and then my relationship to it without worrying heavily about any kind of conceptual content. So the sheepskin is actually grommeted at 5 points. You can probably picture it best on the image on the far left. And then there were eye bolts in the floor, and I was actually standing in the door jamb of this big barn door, so there was eye bolts like in the door jamb and on the ceiling as well, and so the bungee cords were tethering me in there. With this structure in place, I began to experiment with my body's relationship to the comfort of being suspended in sheepskin, and I think at one point I had a sheepskin on the front as well as the back, and I don't know, it was a pretty fun little experiment. Increasingly, my projects have taken into consideration the locus of where they're being presented, with my research looking into systems of economy, history of labor, and political founding of the city and region that I'm about to work in. I'll often spend time collecting objects at flea markets in the region. I'm endeavoring to make an installation that references gathering a sense of that local economy, perhaps as it had been at one point, as well as the labor economy and the tools that give clues to these industries. And in particular, I think I go back to flea markets because you see, as things are increasingly digital or mechanized, you don't have the physical, the tools that laborers that once used as often. And I've found that you can get a sense of that history from these older objects, and also meet a lot of really knowledgeable people about that region, about those forms of labor. I owe a lot to a lot of those flea market vendors for teaching me something about objects. I feel like this is getting to be an overused dirty word or something. In the process of developing the Homemaker series, the one with the wagon, developing that series further into a new body of work to be titled Crafting Settlement, I began thinking not just about the locus that a project grew out of, but the concept of utopia, the ultimate, defined locus. What does it mean to conceive of a community of homes? What does it mean to conceive of an ideal space or place that's driven aesthetically by philosophical principles of living? What would my utopia look like? In researching the iterations of utopia for in my new body of work, Crafting Settlement, I realized there are enough instances where utopian settlements included some kind of element or emphasis or manifesto on craftsmanship, leaving that term kind of open-ended, that I cannot consider it a coincidence. Seeing utopia as both an experiment that's notoriously failed and a holy grail of sorts to lift one's standards, it's this model of being in perpetual search for that ideal home that inspires this body of work. Crafting Settlement was the next body of work building on my Homemaker series, where I decided that I had addressed a nomadic lifestyle, generated the tools for self-sufficient living, and now needed to look to the task of settling down. And this was all conceptually, of course. In trying to envision a settlement, I kept coming back to the structure, how it functions as part of a nomadic system, what vital functions need attention, cooking, storage for provisions, sleeping, etc. For this project, I imposed a New England farmhouse vernacular in order to dictate the arrangement of the structures. On the right is the big house, that's the one holding the hearth. Next to that is the little house. It's a secondary structure that would have expanded the space in the main house and perhaps even served as a kitchen. Behind the lamppost is the back house, which connects to the barn, the more fluorescent orange space. The back house and barn would have sheltered the labor of the house, the cottage industry, livestock, tools. Each of these structures connects seamlessly from one to the next, providing shelter even in the harshest conditions. This is kind of I guess you can see that okay, but it's just a little sketch of an aerial view of how that floor plan worked. But as you can see, I wanted to work with a flexible design with the configuration of the structures, and so the basic footprint of each dwelling structure was a hexagon. And this pattern repeats in my work, and you've already seen it in some of the quilt work that I've shown. From this basic shape, you can add on in various configurations. You can make a double wide or a triple unit all clustered together, or even a massive 7-structure conglomerate with a central hearth. I mean, I really liked the way it wasn't just expanding out. If you were to picture a square expanding out, you would have to expand out almost like in the cardinal points, and this gave a lot of flexibility for how the footprint could work. The structure is designed using traditional timber frame joinery techniques on a very petite scale. I say that, and actually that's sort of not true. It's traditional in that they're dry fit joints with a mortise and a peg, but the style of the joints are largely derived from a more Japanese style. I like the style, the dry fit style of joinery because of its ease of assembly and relative simplicity of fabrication. These structures, they dry fit together and can assemble and disassemble pretty quickly. The frame is made of hickory, and the green pegs you see there are lathe-turned nylon. Sorry for the poor image quality. I don't have a better version of this one, but the dwelling structures assembly going up for that solo show, and then this is the moment at which they would start to be skinned with the outer layer. This is an assembly drawing I did to try and work out how the interior and exterior would work. Crafting settlement really, it drew from virtually all of my interests and skills simultaneously. Drafting plans, working with fabricators, woodworking, sewing, dyeing, it encompassed and drew and demanded of me pretty much every skill I had. The structures, once assembled, rely on what I'm referring to as the skins to clad the exterior. The skins are made of a variety of materials to accommodate the various functions of the individual structures, often referencing familiar architectural detailing. If you look all the way down on the leftmost slide, there's, I don't know if you can tell that that's leather on the lower half of that quilt, and it's actually got stitching in it, so it looks like wainscoting, and the upper part then looks like wallpaper. It was an experiment to see how I could get this to reference, how I could get a soft structure to reference architecture without having it be in the realm of something that was really, it was too hokey. It was just kind of borderline, I think. The one on the quilt on the right is the prototype. When I had built just one section of the wall structure, and I really was attracted to the idea of having a dark exterior and a very bright acid green. And actually, the color is a little off here. I think that's my slide, but. It really like an acid green interior, in the same way that actually backpack manufacturers use this technique a lot. They line the bag with a really bright color so that when it's dark out, or even when it's light out and you have this big pit of a bag, you're still able to see what's in there because of the light reflectivity. In addition to the dwelling structures in that exhibition, I was interested in depicting another layer of my domestic thinking with crafting settlement. Around the periphery of the gallery, where I had crafting settlement installed, I displayed 6 different vignettes. This is porch time. In this vignette in particular, the objects adjacent to one another form associations, speaking about the nature of the porch as a threshold space between the privacy of the house and the moment one joins the public world. The scullery larder represents the back end of the house, or the vital inner workings of the house, but also the sort of dirty side that's often hidden from public view. The workshop, in a sense, is for me the hearth of this project. An experienced woodworker might recognize that the collection of tools are all relevant to the process of timber framing, implying that the house and even perhaps the tools may have been made right there by the same hand with the same tools. Hope Chest is a collection of largely functional objects that together form what I am considering a sort of industrial dowry, representing the passing on of skill-based knowledge as opposed to more frivolous decorative objects. The themes I was developing in this section in particular went on to become the basis for my next exhibition, Borderlanders Outfitter, which is part of a larger body of work that I'm still developing titled Living Through Making, and we'll get to these projects shortly. I wanted to actually show you, this is, probably many of you have seen the Half Cut Tea production. That was an interview with me and my work, but I realized that it's been very hard to document installation at the scale that I'm working at. And so I did a little clip of their larger video production which really walks you around the interior of the exhibition space and gives you a sense of scale and the objects in relation to one another. So you may have just heard birds chirping. This is, I'll explain that in a second. So I want to walk you through my concept of living through making, which is a larger umbrella project that I have seen through one iteration, but hope to revisit in the same kind of format. And so it's a concept that incorporates an exhibition and then a companion retreat, utilizing some of the objects in the exhibition. At its core, living through making questions dependence on familiar socioeconomic systems, inspires and instructs individuals to live self-sufficiently through skill-based knowledge, and by so doing, encouraging the perpetuation of making skills in general. Rethinks the potential of commercial exchange, utilizes a multifaceted approach to both exhibiting work and engaging with students, where my work as an artist blends seamlessly with the field work of my students. So the track that's playing is a track that I commissioned from Emily Gustafson, another alum of the Academy, and this was to be played as the ambient soundtrack at the Borderlanders Outfitter exhibition space. So I thought I would pay homage and play. This is really just a clip of that soundtrack. I think the thunder ends soon. She created this soundtrack with very little information. I actually gave her a toolkit and told her a little bit about what I wanted to do, where the show was going to be, and then she took this toolkit, had all these adventures, and went all over Michigan and kept sound recording and recording here, recording there, and then compiled it together into a track that represented her adventures with this toolkit. And it really, I didn't give her any other parameters, and it came out. It was really kind of perfect for the space. And this is, you're hearing maybe like 3 minutes out of a 40-minute track, and it has this whole life. You can tell there's a campfire at one point. There's somebody pounding tent stakes in with some indeterminate object. Maybe can we turn the volume of the soundtrack down just a tiny bit? Thanks. So Borderlanders Outfitter was exhibited at the Pacific Northwest College of Art in Portland, Oregon. This was last year. This exhibition was part of the trial run for my Living Through Making project. In the exhibition, I displayed both older historical works of mine. They were demonstrating the lineage of my thinking about making and self-sufficient practices, as well as a new palette of materials and tools that comprise the Outfitter. The Outfitter included the rope shop, the standard issue toolkits, tool and material libraries were made available for students of the Academy of Survival to equip themselves before heading out into the field. For my Borderlanders Outfitter project, I was particularly fascinated by the notion of Cascadia as a bioregional system and what this kind of convergence of resources could mean for the possibilities of independent living. I'm gonna kill the soundtrack. So again, like going back to that idea of researching the location and bringing the elements of that location into the concept of the work as I'm generating it. The standard issue toolkits were distributed on orientation day. They included mess kits, scout books, pencils, lighters, belts, and custom-made scarves, as well as a place for 2 tools, a length of rope, and two lengths of cloth. This was the tool library. So this was my collection of both made and found tools put on display, and they all went out in the field. This is a big kind of leap of faith for me. And this is a detail of the material library. So students chose 2 materials from the tool library. They had to choose 1 waterproof fabric and 1 insulating fabric. This was the rope shop, and everybody was issued roughly 2 yards of rope of their choosing. Orientation for the Academy of Survival, the companion retreat to Borderlanders Outfitter. So this took place over, I think, a 3-day weekend. The installation and exhibition were reliant on the participation and experiences of the students on the retreat. The Academy was intended to capitalize on the intimacy of a more European educational model akin to the structures of institutions like the Bauhaus and Black Mountain College, kind of lofty aspirations here, with mentors and students living and working and experimenting in proximity. Again, I think I'm drawing from my Cranbrook experiences here too. The Academy presents skill-based knowledge necessary for self-sufficient living, emphasizing cross-pollination of traditional crafts, design innovations, and contemporary bioregional practices while questioning the role that community plays. I'm interested in mentorship as a solution for surviving modern anxieties. The Academy retreat prepared individuals to be self-sufficient using equipment and materials coming directly out of the exhibition, perforating the barrier of traditional museological practice. MFA students from the Pacific Northwest College of Art and students from the Applied Craft and Design Department, that's the MFA program that's affiliated, they applied and were accepted to participate in a 3-day retreat. Prior to their arrival, they were given a manual packed with readings relating to the concepts and principles I was trying to outline in my Living Through Making project. Examples of self-sufficiency, rewilding, and public urban architecture. So there was a whole checkout process. It was like a library. I mean, it's, you got a card and a number, and you were held accountable for every single object that left the building. This is a detail of the toolkits coming together with the objects the way they were meant to be. And people just, I didn't really give them any instruction. They had to figure it out on their own, how they worked. The retreat was originally conceived to be held in a backcountry setting, not unlike my rigorous backcountry work many years ago. But the retreat in August 2014 was graciously hosted by Lee Kelly and Christina Conant of Leland Ironworks, a fitting location that combined elements of like an artist colony with a lot of wildland, padding it around there, and on which we could spread out and camp. I don't know how many of you have been to Portland, Oregon, or are from Portland, Oregon, but it's an incredibly warm and fuzzy and collaborative kind of city. I very quickly was acquainted with many people who helped with this project, and gave many in-kind donations, and was able to realize this project in a way that, at 3,000 miles away, living in Boston, I would never have been able to pull off. Signal Fire was one of the companies that helped me out. Daniela Molnar, she's sitting on the bottom left there. She joined us for the first day and gave like an orientation to not quite backcountry life. And I mean, if we were really in the backcountry, she'd be talking about Leave No Trace and other kinds of, wilderness medicine and that kind of thing. But this was sort of like Leave No Trace light or something. I mean, we had a porta potty, it was just one step below glamping at that point, I think. But they did provide these really romanticized canvas tents for us to sleep in that, they set the backdrop. So there was a series of workshops and then a series of lectures. This is John and Juan He Arndt their husband and wife team who form Studio Gorm. I believe they visited here not that long ago. And they came out, they did a workshop for us on lashing and knotting techniques and encouraged us to create our own tools based on the needs in our newfound camp life. So this is like day one, first afternoon, and we all scattered and found wood and started experimenting with these different knotting techniques. Then Peter Michael Bauer joined us from Rewild Portland. He taught us how to make survival baskets out of urban harvested English ivy roots, which are an invasive species there. I'm not 100% clear as to whether they're an invasive species elsewhere. He's also the one who has redefined the definition of survival for me, and I've had to reconsider this. But Peter founded Rewild Portland after many years of extensive research and field training in survival and research into humanity's complex contemporary relationship with survival. The mission of Rewild Portland is to promote cultural and environmental resilience through the education of earth-based arts, traditions, and technology. You can read into that as you will. He did bring his beaver pelt suit. He did demonstrate how to start a fire with a string and bow. This is the real deal of one variety. So that night, we had this huge dinner, and we were expecting the president of the college to come, some donors. I mean, it was really this sort of like this first time that there was an institutional collaboration suddenly over this project, and then it was about to rain. So we combined resources using the materials borrowed from the exhibition, and the students really sweetly collaborated to make. They brought together all their waterproof materials that I made them bring and string together this tent to shelter this huge table to accommodate the dinner we were about to have. So I felt like that was a really great, and using the knotting techniques we just learned from John and Juan He. One of the most unique aspects of the Academy retreat was the combination of life outdoors, camping and eating outdoors, as well as the incorporation of a rigorous programmatic series. In addition to the workshops we participated in by day, we hosted 4 fireside lectures. So the photo is taken sitting at the fire pit, and then we have just the good old sheet strung in between 2 trees and a projector and the stars above us. It was pretty fantastic. So the lecture series consisted of, first night, John and Juan He of Studio Gorm, Peter Michael Bauer of Rewild Portland, and on the second night, B.D. Wortham Galvin. She's an architect and professor at Portland State University. She spoke on contingent urbanism, Sarah Margolis Pinio, she was the curator working with me on the show, and at the time worked for the Museum of Contemporary Craft. She presented what she considered a conversational lecture, giving historical precedent to the Living Through Making project and the premise for the Academy retreat. We did a lot of talking. The following are just a few images of some of the experiments and activities of the students. This is Ryan's belt basket. This is the sauna on the left was a previous applied craft and design build project, but we ended up adding on to it and then creating tools. Like suddenly we wanted to fire up the sauna, and then we needed a ladle for the water, so we made ladles out of leaves and basket woven bowls, and I don't know, we were just like suddenly we're improvising everything. And on the right, this guy Tyler, his work involved dyeing with invasive species, so he was collecting a lot of material around the property and washing it in the river, and that was one of the baskets that he made during the Rewild workshop. Mikhail designed a raft that was very unsuccessful, but got a lot of people into the water and swimming. There was a backstrap loom that was created, and I believe a whole belt length weaving created off that loom. And this was the whole troupe of us. How am I doing for time? Because I could stop here, or I have one more project to go through. Are we good? Good? Okay. So this is where I'm at now. Most recent exhibition, this is my first ever attempt at collaboration. I've always worked very independently. And though Kate and I did not actually make any one object together, we had many, many meetings talking about doing this two-person show together, and decided through a process of sort of wordplay that the title would be called Interdependence, because I thought about independence, and she thought about identity, and the word interdependence seemed to bridge our worlds and the vocabulary of our objects. So when it came time to install this at Connecticut College, again, there wasn't a curator, there wasn't anybody working with us. It was really just us managing this whole thing, and which is both a big burden to an artist, but also it gives you all the freedom in the world. Just put this over here. Hey, let's try it over there. So we just mix and matched our work and didn't have a labeling system. We chose to have a handout that people could follow, and it was really interesting to intentionally have works complement one another. I'm not even going to point out what's my work. I mean, I think it's sort of obvious probably at this point which is my work and which is Kate's, but I think the point being that it was a very satisfying, playful installation, and from that we are looking forward to potentially starting to collaborate on the conception and fabrication of objects from start to finish. I also, too, was taking this as an opportunity to back off from a really complicated set of installations where, it was immersive, and really just use components of my installations and make a looser dialogue, almost like a visual, verbal dialogue of the objects in relation to one another. This one, I'm not even going to talk about this one, but this is like the whole history of man in one frame. It's like invention of fire and the wheel and Mountain Dew and hand tools and correspondence, and I don't know, it's just kind of everything. I think that's it. That's a photo of my, that's the reality of my studio, by the way. That's, everyone thinks I'm so organized, but that's the end of the day, that's what it really is. But that's it. So, thank you.